Blood dripped off the knife as I stepped into the dark bedroom. On the bed, the divine prophet Magnus was propped on one elbow, looking sleepily toward the door. "All sure?" he said. I only took a moment to revel in the fact that I was here. It was the culmination of so much work. The man who lay on the massive bed in the richly adorned bedroom was the personification of all that was wrong in the world. I looked at him and saw what had been taken from me and from others like me. And although I wasn't excited to kill him, I did feel a thrill of determination as I rushed through the lavish bedroom. By the time Magnus realized the danger he was in, I was already bearing down on him. He scrambled away on the bed, screaming out for help. I jumped after him, bringing the knife down. He jerked away at the last moment, and the knife cut a gash in his thigh. He screamed again, and I knew I wouldn't be making it out of here alive. Not now, not with all the noise he was making. It didn't matter. As long as I could end his life, it didn't matter what happened to me. He fell off the other side of the bed, and I jumped down on top of him, straddling his hips. I drove the knife into his stomach as he screamed and fought. He tried to choke me, so I sliced his arms open until he withdrew them. The screams of hundreds of people, screams from my childhood, sounded in my head, as if those dying people were in the room with me. The smell of burning wood and searing flesh came back, mixing with the pungent metallic smell of Magnus's blood. I stabbed him in the chest and the throat and the face. I stabbed him a dozen times before he stopped moving, and then a dozen more before someone hit me in the head and then pulled me off of the divine prophet. Someone wrenched the knife out of my hands, but I kept my gaze fixed on Magnus's mangled body. "It's too late," I said. I wanted to laugh, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. "It's too late. He's dead. It's over." "Not quite," a voice said from behind me. Chills went up my spine at the sound of that voice. It's impossible, I thought. But then I turned and looked over my shoulder, and my guts went cold as I saw him. "Here, make it look like a suicide." Janesh held the razor blade out to me in a latex-gloved hand. We stood just outside a cramped bathroom in a cramped room in a shitty part of town. It was an extended-stay motel, the kind where cockroaches stay for free because the owners are too cheap to spray the place for bugs. Inside the bathroom, two men held a third down in the bathtub. The two guys were Suez and Lithram. Those weren't the names they'd been given at birth, though. I'd never met a white guy named Suez, or anyone for that matter. Nor had I ever met a Hispanic guy named Lithram. They held down a small, struggling man who had been named Egrin, but whose real name was Silas. We just spent a few minutes stripping him down to his underwear while Janesh held a hand over his mouth so he wouldn't disturb the neighbors. Not that the police would have been called even if someone had heard him screaming. It wasn't the kind of place where terrified screaming was out of the norm. What an awful place to die, I thought, staring at the proffered razor blade. I almost shook my head, but that would have been bad. That would have been really bad. "Well," Janesh said, "are you in or not? I thought you wanted to serve him. This is how you do that. This is how you earn a place at his side." "Of course," I said, taking the razor blade and stepping into the bathroom. "Remember, from the wrist up toward the elbow, it has to look like he did it himself." The light above the sink buzzed and flickered. As I glanced into the cracked mirror, I glimpsed the old burn scar on the side of my neck, and I was reminded why I had to do this, why I had to kill this man whose name was Silas. I thought of all the lives I would save, all the lives I could only save if I did this thing. If I didn't do this, my chance would be gone. It would disappear like a cockroach scurrying back down a sink drain, and I couldn't have that. So I stepped between Suez and Lithram, getting to my knees next to the tub. Silas's eyes stared up at me over Lithram's gloved hand clamped over his mouth. He whimpered. He shook his head as much as he could, which wasn't much. He was pleading with me to let him live. "I'm sorry," I thought, as I reached toward his left arm, which Lithram gripped with his other hand. My hand shook badly right up until I pierced his skin with the corner of the razor blade. Blood welled up and then poured out as I dragged the blade up from his wrist to the middle of his forearm. Suez held Silas's legs down with one hand, and with his other, he pinned the man's right hand against the dirty tile wall. Still, Silas convulsed for several minutes, trying to scream, to escape. The blood flowed down the off-white porcelain and around his bare legs before disappearing into the drain. Finally, he grew still and then stopped moving altogether. His eyes stayed open. When it was clear he was dead, we positioned him so it looked like he'd done the cutting himself. Then we checked the room over for any potential evidence. We were all wearing gloves, so there wouldn't be any fingerprints. And we were all wearing snug-fitting clothes and ball caps to reduce the chances of leaving behind hairs that could tie us to the scene. Janesh took off his clothes at the door. Suez opened it for him, and Janesh left first and got into the car. From the car, he watched and made sure it was clear before calling Suez and telling him we could all come out. It was dark outside, and I saw no one around as we walked down the exterior stairs into the car. Janesh drove us back to the other vehicle we'd stashed, a Cadillac Escalade. Lithram drove the Escalade behind us as we brought the beat-up sedan to a notoriously bad part of the city, where we left the vehicle with the doors unlocked and the keys inside. Then we all got into the Escalade and drove to the compound. It was well after midnight by the time we arrived. And, for the first time since joining the group 2 years prior, I was invited up to the big house. The house was a 4-story mansion built into the side of a hill overlooking the valley in which the rest of the compound sat. The divine prophet Magnus hadn't built the house, but he'd bought it along with the 1,200 acres it sat upon and had the compound built in the valley underneath. We parked in one of 3 2-car garages that made up the first floor of the mansion. As we moved through the garage toward the stairs to the rest of the mansion, I spotted a heavy metal door with several locks on the outside. Given the layout of the garage, it seemed odd to me that a door would be there since it looked like it would only lead toward the hill on which the house had been built. Then I assumed it was just a storage room with important papers or financial information pertaining to the operation of the People's Church of Divinity. Janesh leading the way, we moved up the stairs and emerged in a wide, richly decorated hallway. The other 3 men joked now that the job was done, and we were back in the safety of the compound. But I stayed quiet, looking around in awe at my surroundings. We went to the vast kitchen, where Janesh started pulling leftovers out of the refrigerator. "You hungry, Lythan?" Suez asked as he opened a cabinet with plates and other dishes inside. I shook my head. I still hated the name Lythan. My real name was Evan, and every time I heard the name Lythan, I said my real name in my head. Magnus was the one who named everyone. It was just one of the many ways he incorporated his followers into the cult. Take away a person's name and give them one of your own choosing, and they'll do pretty much anything for you. But it wasn't like he was forcing people to give up their names. No, that's not how cults work. By the time his followers got to the point where it was time to change names, they wanted to give the last shred of their identities over to Magnus. They saw it as an honor. It was simply the one gesture in a long line of gestures designed specifically to assimilate people into the cult. After people gave up their names, it only followed that they no longer had any need for the money in their bank accounts or the houses in their names. Even before the name-changing honor that every true believer went through, the divine prophet Magnus was slowly bleeding these people dry by asking for donations to keep up the good work, all the while talking about how material goods would be of no use to anyone once salvation was upon them. And all the followers were too blind, too brainwashed, to see that while they lived in cramped buildings and worked their fingers to the bone around the property every day, Father Magnus sat up in this mansion, doing God knows what. The line that his closest sycophants often gave to anyone who even hinted at the hypocrisy was that Magnus had been gifted the entire property by one of his devout followers just before the old man died. They would often follow this lie up with the fact that Magnus needed privacy and quiet to commune with the Great One in preparation for the ultimate salvation. But the thing is, property documents are a matter of public record. And before I ever joined this group, when I was doing my research, I'd found that the property hadn't been given to him. He'd bought it outright for nearly $20 million. He'd bought it with money siphoned from his followers' pockets. Because, contrary to popular belief, you don't have to have something wrong with you to join a cult. You don't have to be down on your luck or even struggling financially to be drawn into the web of lies. And in a society where the size of your bank account is directly and falsely related to the size of your IQ, it was no surprise that several very rich people had given all they had to Father Magnus. They thought they were giving it to the group as a whole. And in a way, this was true. They were paving the way for the group to commit mass suicide when the time came for the ultimate salvation. From the research I'd done, it seemed to me that Magnus had targeted them directly. This made sense. After all, what is a cult leader without a compound? Might as well have been a preacher with a fragmented flock until he secured this place. Of course, I knew how it worked. I knew all too well, which was the whole reason I was standing in the cavernous kitchen to begin with. It was a milestone of sorts for me, but my mission was far from accomplished. The most important part was yet to come. But there was still one question on my mind. If you kill a cult leader, does the cult fall apart? Or does someone else set up and take his place? Not that the question was going to keep me from my mission. I would find out the answer one way or another, or I would die trying.
I didn't feel much like eating after my first one either,
Lutheran said to me, slapping me on the back.
You'll be okay.
I wondered how many people these men had killed in the name of the People's Church of Divinity. They certainly seemed to have no qualms about what we'd just done. They microwaved food made by the 2 personal chefs who cooked for Magnus and his select group of security guards. I stood apart, trying to calm myself down. I was here in the house finally. It was a big step, and I was having trouble getting my heart to stop beating so hard. A door shut behind me, and I turned to look down the hall. Father Magnus was there, looking right at me. He'd just come through the door up from the garage, but that didn't seem right. We hadn't seen him in the garage, and all the cars had been there, so he hadn't been out. Besides, he never left without at least 2 bodyguards. Father Magnus was an unassuming man in his 50s with a handsome face, small ears, and deep brown eyes. He smiled at me as he walked forward dressed in a bright white velour tracksuit. He was barefoot, as was often the case. As his eyes fixed on my face, I had to admit that there was something about him. He had a magnetism and an unswerving confidence that was impossible to fake. I'd only been this close to him twice before, once at my naming ceremony and once more when I met with him to give over all the money in my bank account. It was a considerable sum, and I knew it would help me get into his inner circle, and it had worked. "Lythan," Father Magnus said as he approached, his voice as soft and smooth as the velour tracksuit he wore. He was about 6 feet tall, making him slightly shorter than me. He grabbed my hands and looked into my eyes. "Is it done? Have you done your duty to protect all your brothers and sisters?" I nodded, unable to speak. I'd never touched him before. He was so close. I could just reach out and put my hands around his throat. His smile turned sad. "You've done a great service. It's not easy, but I only ask the things of you that I know you can handle." "Yes, Father," I said. "I'm so glad you're here. Get something to eat, okay?" I nodded again as he let go of my hands. He then went up to the other 3 men in turn, talking to them in the same hushed tones he'd used with me. These big men who just helped murder a man in cold blood turned into helpless kittens in Father Magnus's presence. It was as though God himself was standing there talking to them. Really, it wasn't far from the truth. To them, he was as close to God as they'd ever seen. When he was done, he said goodnight to everyone and headed through the living room and up the stairs. I watched him go, thinking about all the ways I could kill him. It wouldn't be all that hard, now that I was part of the inner circle. All the awful things I'd done to get here would be worth it if I could keep him from killing the 1,054 men, women, and children who lived on the property. Absently, I reached up and dragged my fingers across the burn scar in the side of my neck. The hard part would be getting out alive, but that was a secondary concern. If I accomplished my mission, then I could die without regret. The bedroom Janesh showed me to was on the second floor, right down the hall from his room. In fact, all the personal bodyguards were housed in this wing of the mansion. There were a total of 8 of us, now that I had joined the ranks. I knew that there were 2 guards posted outside the house every night, in addition to the other guards at the one and only entrance to the vast property. Of course, the guards at the gate were not part of Father Magnus's inner circle. They were simply trusted men and women from the lower ranks of the cult hierarchy. The rest of Magnus's personal bodyguards took shifts during the day until he went down to the cathedral to give his afternoon sermon to his followers. Then all the bodyguards were on duty to make sure things went smoothly. And as his flock grew, so did his personal protection detail, which was why I was there at all, the newest member of the inner circle. Once I'd taken a look around the room, which was nicely furnished and featured a queen-sized bed, I stepped into the attached bathroom and looked in the mirror.
Tonight's the night,
I said to my reflection. Now or never. The longer I stayed with these men, the more likely it was that I'd slip up or do something to make them suspicious. And I couldn't have that. So I had to do it now. Tonight. I couldn't wait. And I didn't want to wait. I unbuttoned my dark blue collared shirt and then took it off. And I stood there in front of the mirror, inspecting the burn scar that went down the right side of my neck and across my right shoulder, down the arm to the elbow. The deformed skin wrapped down the right side of my back as well, ending just below my rib cage. As I inspected it, I forced my memory back to that night nearly 10 years ago. I gripped my mother's hand tight in my left hand, my father's in my right. We were running through the cold night air, having been abruptly woken by panicked shouts. The large wooden church was little more than a blot in the night sky ahead, but as we rounded the side toward the front of the structure, we saw the inviting orange glow coming from the open front doors. Dozens of other people hustled forward around us. Some were shouting in either exasperation or excitement, or both. The cult was called the Church of the Prophet Daniel, and I'd been living within the walls of the compound in rural Wyoming for 7 years. At 14, I didn't really know what was happening. I simply trusted in my parents, knowing that they would protect me against the people who were said to be attacking the place. Our leader, Daniel, had been telling us for 2 years that we would soon be attacked for our faith, that the outside world would try to tear us apart because they had succumbed to the evil of what Daniel called the demon class. He said children would be ripped away from their parents and that couples would be torn from each other if we allowed it to happen. As we got into the church, my groggy teenage mind slowly clearing, I knew Daniel was right. They were here. They were attacking us. But my parents would never let them take me away. To this day, I don't know who set the fires, but they seemed to sprout up from all sides of the building in the middle of Daniel's impassioned speech about our faith being rewarded in the afterlife. Pretty soon, the walls of the wooden church were engulfed in flames. People were screaming. I looked around in panic, but my parents still held my hands in theirs. My dad kept whispering for me to pray. I couldn't understand how he could just sit there and pray as people screamed in pain all around. It was so hot, and the smoke was choking my lungs, stinging my eyes. The smell of burning flesh invaded my nostrils and made me gag. Still, Daniel preached from the stage, growing more and more manic as the flames closed in. Between fits of coughing, I pleaded with my mother to let us leave. I begged her. And finally, she yanked me away from my father, and we ran for the doors. My dad screamed behind us and gave chase, but a flaming beam fell from the ceiling and crushed him to the ground, along with a half-dozen others. The doors to the church were covered in flames, but my mother ran straight into them, breaking a small hole in the door while her flesh sizzled. She reared back and hit the door again, making a bigger hole. I could see the flames all over her, eating at her skin. She pulled me forward and shoved me through the ragged hole. As she did, a piece of the door frame fell down, hitting me in the right shoulder and back. I fell to the ground just outside the church, screaming at the pain as my simple blue pajamas caught fire. By the time I rolled around enough to get the flames out, I realized my mother was no longer with me. Looking back at the church door, I could see nothing but flames inside. I backed away from the immense heat, coughing and staring at the door, willing her to come out. And I stood like that until the church finally collapsed. When the first people to arrive were firefighters, I realized that the story about us being under attack was a lie. I realized it was all one big lie, a lie my parents died for. And from that moment, I decided I would dedicate my life to stopping that lie from taking any more innocent lives, which meant silencing the mouth that spoke the lie and silencing it forever. Peering around the corner of the 4th floor hallway, I spotted a man Magnus had named Ulsher. He stood guard in front of a set of double doors. Seeing that Magnus had a guard posted outside his bedroom was a surprise. But it didn't matter. I backed away and slid the knife into the back waistband of my simple white cotton pants. Then I took a couple of deep breaths and moved around the corner. Ulsher saw me immediately, tensing up for a moment. Before he had a chance to speak, I said,
I need to see him, please.
I kept walking toward the bedroom at the end of the hallway. The guard shook his head, putting a hand out. I knew he had a pistol on him, all the most trusted guards did, but he hadn't reached for it yet. I didn't think he would, at least not until it was too late.
He's sleeping,
Ulsher said. As I walked up to the guard, I reached my right hand to the hip on that side, as if scratching an itch. Then I darted the hand back and grabbed the knife I'd taken from the kitchen. Ulsher's eyes went wide when he saw the blade come out, but I was already shoving it toward his neck. He brought his hands up, but it was too late. I grabbed the back of his head with my left hand and jammed the blade up under his chin, angling it up toward where the brainstem met the spinal cord. I had to strain to get the knife all the way back, but when I did, Ulsher's legs went out from under him. I guided him down to the carpet as best I could, but he still made a considerable thump. Bloody knife in hand, I stepped toward the door and opened it. The bedroom was dark, but I could see with the light from the hallway that Magnus was propped up in bed, looking sleepily toward the door.
Ulsher,
he said. I rushed into the lavish bedroom, and by the time Magnus realized the danger he was in, I was already bearing down on him. He scrambled away on the bed, screaming out for help. I jumped up onto the bed, bringing the knife down. He jerked away at the last moment, and the knife cut a gash in his thigh. He screamed again, and I knew I wouldn't be making him out of here alive. Not now, not with all the noise he was making. It didn't matter. He fell off the other side of the bed, and I jumped down on top of him, straddling his hips. I drove the knife into his stomach as he screamed and fought. He tried to choke me, so I sliced his arms open until he withdrew them. In my head, the screams of all the people in that wooden church returned, as if they were in the room with me. The smell of burning wood and searing flesh came back, mixing with the pungent, metallic smell of Magnus's blood. I stabbed him in the chest and the throat and the face. I stabbed him a dozen times before he stopped moving, and then a dozen more before someone hit me in the head and then pulled me off. Someone wrenched the knife out of my hands, but I kept my gaze fixed on Magnus's mangled body.
It's too late,
I said. I wanted to laugh, but I couldn't bring myself to do it.
It's too late. He's dead. It's over.
Not quite, a voice said from behind me. It sounded like Magnus, but that wasn't possible. I turned to look over my shoulder, seeing Janesh directly behind me. He was holding my arms behind my back, slipping zip ties over my hands. Then Magnus came into view, walking around to inspect the dead body on the floor. His body. I thought I'd gone insane, and for one terrifying moment, I was sure that Magnus was the real thing, a real prophet come to Earth for the salvation of mankind. Nothing else seemed to explain how I just stabbed him to death, but he was somehow standing beside me, untouched. He looked at me with those dark eyes. Then he looked at the body. After a moment, he shook his head solemnly.
Do you know how much plastic surgery we had to do to get him to look like me?
I stared, gape-mouthed. Magnus shrugged.
I guess it was worth it in the end. But I'll have to find another double now. I'm sure you won't be the last to try and kill me.
He paused, looking at the body again.
Wow, you really do hate me, don't you? What did I do to you? Do you have a family member in the cult or something?
I was speechless. I couldn't believe it. I killed a double. A fucking body double. A heavy sickness settled in my gut as I looked back at the dead man on the floor.
Take him down to the garage,
Magnus said to Janesh and the several other guards who were now in the room.
I'll be down there shortly.
Janesh kicked me in the face, splitting my eyebrow, which filled my eye with blood. Suez kicked me in the back, and then Lithram kicked me in the back of the head. I was curled up on the garage floor, near the door with all the locks. Pain radiated through every part of my body.
That's enough,
Magnus shouted out, having just come down the stairs. He was wearing a one-piece jumpsuit like the kind janitors wear.
Did I tell you to beat him up?
He said, coming swiftly forward.
Sorry, Father,
Lithram said.
This one is mine. Mine and mine alone. Do you understand me?
Magnus said.
Why do you think I asked you to bring him down here? Sorry, Father,
Janesh said. They all had their eyes cast down. Magnus stepped over and retrieved a pair of keys from his pocket. He unlocked the several locks on the door and then opened it.
Bring him in here.
The other men did as they were told, bringing me through the doorway and into a hall with brick walls that seemed to go back a good 40 yards into the hill. It was some kind of bunker, I realized. At Magnus's direction, the men took me to a room on the right side of the hall. They strapped me to a chair there, and even through my blurred vision, I could see the table nearby with all kinds of tools and implements of torture. There was a drain in the floor, caked with dried blood and little tufts of hair.
Now get out and leave me be,
Magnus said.
I'm going to take my time with this one.
The other men shuffled out, Magnus following. I heard the door from the garage shut, and then I heard the locks sliding into place. Moments later, Magnus was back in the room. He knelt down in front of me and looked into my eyes. I could feel my eyelids swelling, and my one eyebrow was still bleeding heavily.
Who are you?
He asked. There was something strange about him. He didn't possess the same easy gravitas as earlier in the night. I thought maybe he was scared by what I'd done to his double.
Does it matter? Yes, it does. So tell me why you want to kill me so bad. If you won't tell me willingly, I will have to get creative.
He gestured with his head to the tools on the nearby table. Seeing that I had nothing to lose, I told him about how I'd lived in a cult from 7 to 14, and I told him about how my parents had died in the fire deliberately set by cult members. He listened to my story with interest. When it was done, he stood up and crossed his arms, deep in thought. He stood there for a long time. Then, there was a loud knock from the door to the garage, which made him jump.
Father!
Janesh's voice called.
Father, I need to speak to you.
Magnus looked toward the hallway and then back at me. He said nothing. A glimmer of realization came to me.
Father?
Janesh called.
What's the phrase? What's the phrase, Father?
We need to go,
Magnus said to me, grabbing a pair of pliers from the table to cut my binds.
You're not him, are you?
I asked, almost in a daze.
You're not the real him. You're the double. There's some phrase that only the real Magnus knows, so they can tell us apart. They must have forgotten to ask in all the excitement, but they know now. They figured it out.
Janesh was now yelling and banging on the door. Magnus finished cutting the straps and I stood up. He directed us out into the hall, and we moved down the corridor, past rooms on both sides.
Why are you doing this?
I asked. The banging was getting louder behind us. They were trying to break the door down.
I was a true believer,
he said as we walked.
I really was. I was honored when he asked me to be his double. But then I found this place. He turned this bunker into a torture dungeon, and he would select followers. He would bring them up here and kill them. Then his guards would tell everyone that the person ran away or something, and no one ever questioned him.
We passed a room, and I glanced in, seeing a woman's body slumped in a chair, eyes gouged out, and stab wounds all over. The body wasn't rotting yet, so it must have happened recently.
You didn't know he was torturing people?
I asked. The double shook his head.
Not until just a few days ago. There's a shower down here and a bunch of fresh clothes. but I noticed he was coming down here more and more, and that he would always come out with different clothes on than when he went in. I managed to sneak the keys away from him one day. I've been looking for a way to make things right ever since. I had no idea that you were looking for something similar.
I looked at him, amazed.
And his guards know? Oh yes, they know.
We ducked into a room. The sound of the door breaking down echoed down the hall behind us. There was a hidden panel in the wall that opened when the double pressed it in a certain corner. Inside, there was a ladder leading straight up. He started climbing, and I followed.
How did you find this?
I asked.
The panel was open when I came in here to look around. I climbed all the way up to see where it goes. It will let us out in a clearing behind a rocky outcropping.
We came out in a clearing just like he said, closing the camouflage trapdoor behind us.
Now what?
I asked. We were near the top of the hill behind the mansion. The double brought out the keys and jingled them.
Now we get into the Range Rover and get the hell out of here. What about all the followers?
No more leader, no more cult, he said.
Besides, if I hear about someone taking Magnus's place, I can always make an announcement about how the new leader is a false prophet or something. I can convince the followers to go back to their lives. After all, I'm him as far as anyone else is concerned.
For the first time in a long time, I smiled. We moved down the hill toward the mansion. Since the garage doors were closed, we had to go through the house to get to the Range Rover. The double used the keys to open the back door, and we crept through, listening for movement.
I bet they're all in the bunker, looking for us,
he whispered. We came to the garage steps, and I paused before going down.
Wait here for 1 minute,
I said.
What? Why? There's something I need to do.
Just over 2 minutes later, we moved down the stairs into the garage. We got in the Range Rover and opened the garage door. The double drove, reversing out as soon as the door was up. We spun around in the driveway and plowed down toward the road out. I turned in my seat and watched the mansion recede through the back window.
What did you do in there?
The double asked.
You'll see.
Moments later, an explosion rocked the house, blasting out the windows and doors. Flames licked the structure from the inside.
Holy God!
The double said.
How'd you do that? Natural gas can blow up a house under the right circumstances. And that house had 2 gas ovens and 2 gas-powered fireplaces. Didn't take long to sabotage them. Once the gas builds up, even a refrigerator's compressor kicking on can cause a spark big enough to ignite the gas.
We sped through the night, and when we got to the gate, it only took one word from the double to get the guards to open it. Then he told them to gather everyone else and get off the property as soon as possible. As we left the compound behind, we were silent for several miles. Then the double glanced at me and said,
I have access to Magnus's bank accounts.
He patted a pocket.
He keeps all his information in a little black book, which I have right here. Are you saying what I think you're saying?
I asked. He nodded.
We can give all those people their money back, make them whole again.
I grinned.
And who knows,
he said.
From what I understand, Magnus was pretty successful before he became a cult leader. Maybe there will be a couple million left over for us.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy these stories, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and check out some more of my episodes here.